Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. It started like any other solo camping trip, the kind I've done hundreds of times as a park ranger in the Pacific Northwest. The forest up here has a way of swallowing you whole, but it's always felt like home. That was until last week. I can't explain what happened, but I can't shake the feeling that I was being watched or hunted. It was late September, the time of year when the nights turn cold and the days feel like they're slipping through your fingers. I had a few days off and decided to hike up to one of the more remote areas of the park, where the trees stretch so tall they seem to scrape the sky. No one comes up here this late in the season, not unless you're looking for solitude, the kind that wraps around you like a blanket or a noose, depending on your perspective. The first day went as expected. I hiked up a ridge, pitched my tent by a small stream, and settled in. The air was crisp, the sky a deep bruised purple as dusk settled in. I built a fire, cooked some dinner, and leaned back against my pack, watching the stars prick through the darkening sky. But as the fire crackled and the sounds of the forest faded into the background, I noticed something strange. Silence. Not the regular, peaceful quiet of the wilderness, but a dead, suffocating stillness. No crickets, no wind. Even the water from the stream seemed to hush itself. I tried to shake it off, figuring maybe I was just overthinking things. But then I heard it. A faint rustling just beyond the tree line. I glanced over, expecting to see a deer or maybe even a black bear. Instead, there was nothing. Just thick shadows swaying as if the trees themselves were alive. I told myself it was fine, that I was just tired from the hike and the isolation was getting to me. But when I crawled into my tent, I couldn't sleep. Every few minutes, I'd hear that same rustling, faint and inconsistent, like something or someone was circling my camp. It wasn't until around midnight that things got worse. I'd been lying there, wide awake, when I heard something heavy moving through the brush. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My hand instinctively went to the bear spray clipped to my belt, but I stayed quiet, listening. The footsteps stopped at the edge of my campsite. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the thin walls of my tent, praying whatever it was would lose interest and leave. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl, deep and unnatural, like no animal I'd ever heard. I stayed frozen, every muscle in my body tense. The growl turned into a snarl, then a series of rapid clicks, like something was trying to communicate. The footsteps started again, this time moving closer to my tent. I couldn't breathe. The shadow loomed just outside, tall and distorted in the firelight. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the flames, but the shape was all wrong. It looked vaguely human, but hunched over, its arms hanging too low, its head misshapen. And then it spoke, not in a language I understood, but it mimicked my own voice. Help. Please. Help me. It was the sound of me calling out, but warped, distorted, like someone was trying to remember what a human should sound like. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. My mind raced through every story I'd heard about the creatures that stalk these woods. The legends of skinwalkers, shapeshifters, creatures that mimic the voices of the living to lure them out into the dark. I stayed as still as I could, my hand gripping the bear spray so tightly I thought it might snap. The creature circled my tent again, dragging something heavy behind it, something that scraped and thumped against the ground. And then it stopped. The growling, the clicks, the footsteps, they all went silent. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for dawn, terrified to move or even breathe. When the first light of morning broke through the canvas of my tent, I finally gathered the courage to crawl out. My fire had burned down to embers, and there were deep, jagged marks in the dirt as if something had been dragged away into the woods. But the strangest thing, The thing that still haunts me was that my own boot prints were everywhere, as if I had been pacing around my camp in the middle of the night, even though I never left my tent. I packed up and started down the trail as fast as I could, keeping my eyes on the trees, listening for any sign that I wasn't alone. But the forest was eerily quiet, just like the night before. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive stillness. As I made my way back to the ranger station, I tried to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a tall, dark figure darting between the trees, always just out of sight. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I reached the station, something made my blood run cold. My co-worker, Dave, was waiting for me at the entrance, a concerned look on his face. He held up a radio, the same one I always carry with me on hikes. "Found this in the woods," he said, his voice low. "Thought you might have dropped it." I stared at the radio, my stomach twisting into knots. It wasn't mine. I'd left mine back in my truck. Before I could say anything, Dave continued, "You know what's weird, though? I heard you over the radio last night. You were calling for help." I looked at him, the blood draining from my face. "I never used the radio," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Dave frowned, confused, and then the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as he added, "Well, someone did, and they sounded just like you." The forest hasn't felt like home since that night. I don't think it ever will again. Whatever's out there, it's still waiting, and it knows my voice. It's strange how the woods change at night. During the day, the forest is full of life, birds chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional deer slipping through the brush. But when the sun sets and darkness claims the trees, it's as if the whole place holds its breath. The air grows thicker, the shadows deepen, and something in the stillness makes you feel watched. I've always loved camping, though. Something about being disconnected from the world, the raw isolation of it, appealed to me. But after this last trip, I'll never step foot in the woods again. It was a solo trip, a decision I regret more than anything now. I had chosen a remote section of the forest, one far off the beaten paths. No marked trails, no fellow campers. Just me and miles of dense, untouched wilderness. It was perfect. I wanted quiet. A few days to myself. The first night went as expected, a crackling fire, a sky so clear the stars looked like diamonds scattered on velvet, and the peaceful sounds of the forest settling in for the night. But it was the second night when things started to feel off. I had been hiking all day, exploring the deeper parts of the woods, and returned to my camp just before sunset. As I was preparing dinner, I noticed the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, not even the distant hum of insects. The stillness was unnerving, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just that time of night. Maybe the animals were quieting down for the evening. But as the night dragged on, the silence persisted. It was around midnight when I heard it, the distant snapping of branches, heavy and deliberate. I froze, listening. The sound was far off, but it didn't belong. It was too slow for an animal, too rhythmic. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the trees, but there was nothing. No movement. No eyes reflecting back at me. Just empty forest. I tried to sleep, but my nerves wouldn't let me. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again, closer this time. Branches cracking, twigs snapping. Whatever it was coming toward me. I reminded myself that it could be anything, a deer, a bear even. But something about the sound, about the way it moved, felt wrong, too purposeful. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleeping. I was sitting by the fire, poking at the embers, when I caught the first glimpse of movement. Just beyond the tree line, something tall, too tall, slipped between the trunks. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood, straining to see, but whatever it was had vanished. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, my mind playing tricks on me in the dark, but then I heard the voice. Help. Me. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but it was unmistakable. A woman's voice, weak and desperate, somewhere in the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated. Every instinct told me to stay by the fire, to stay put. But the voice came again, closer this time. Please, help. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. I walked into the trees, the beam of my flashlight sweeping the ground. I didn't get far, maybe 20 yards, before I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. There was a figure standing perfectly still between the trees, tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long and thin, and its head was wrong. Too big for its body, tilted at a strange angle, as if it had been broken and left to dangle. But the worst part, the part that made me want to run back to my tent and never look behind me again, was the face. It wasn't a face at all. It was smooth, featureless skin stretched tight over bone. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale flesh. I staggered back, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. When I looked up again, the figure was gone, but the voice was still there. "Help me," it whispered, this time from behind me. I scrambled to my feet and ran, sprinting back toward my camp. My heart was hammering so loud I could barely hear the blood rushing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the fire, panting and wide-eyed. I felt like I was being hunted. I collapsed into my chair, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. I didn't hear any more sounds that night, but I didn't sleep either. The forest felt wrong, twisted somehow, like I was no longer alone, and whatever was out there was watching. The next morning I packed up camp, ready to leave as soon as possible. But when I reached the trailhead, there was a man waiting for me. He was dressed like a park ranger, standard green uniform, wide-brimmed hat, but something about him seemed off too. His eyes were too dark, too empty, his skin too pale. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I know," I muttered, barely able to meet his gaze. "I'm leaving." He nodded, but before I could walk past him, he added, "Some things out here, they mimic what they hear, take forms you recognize, but they're not human, and they're never alone." A cold shiver ran down my spine as I looked at him. Something in the back of my mind screamed that this man, this ranger, wasn't what he seemed either. But I kept walking, my legs stiff, my heart pounding. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole way. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I realized I hadn't told him about the voice I heard, or what I saw. And yet, he knew. And now late at night I hear it again, faint, drifting through the trees beyond my house. That same voice. "Help me." I don't answer, I don't look. But I know it's out there, waiting, and it knows where I live. I've always considered myself an experienced camper. Years of navigating forests, setting up campsites, and sleeping under the stars had given me a certain confidence. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened last weekend. A few buddies and I had planned a trip to Black Hollow Woods, a stretch of wilderness far from civilization. It was dense, remote, and perfect for a weekend of getting away from it all. But, as fate would have it, all my friends bailed at the last minute. Work, family commitments, you name it. I didn't want to cancel the trip, so I decided to go alone. It wasn't the first time I'd camped solo, and something about the isolation excited me. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon, my pack heavy with gear. The sun was already sinking, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The trees in Black Hollow Woods were massive, their thick trunks giving the place a claustrophobic feel. I hiked for about 3 hours, pushing deeper into the woods until the trail became almost non-existent. That's where I set up camp, right in the heart of nowhere. As dusk turned to night, the sounds of the forest became more pronounced. The hooting of distant owls, the rustle of leaves as small creatures scurried about. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow around my tent. It was peaceful at first. About an hour after nightfall, I heard it. a howl. It cut through the night, long and haunting, somewhere deep in the woods. I've heard wolves before, but this was different. It wasn't quite animal, but not human either. It didn't sound right. It was too deliberate, too measured, like it was meant for something. My heart skipped a beat as I sat there, staring into the dark trees. Another howl echoed, closer this time. I told myself it was just a wolf. Wolves weren't common in these parts, but not impossible. Still, there was something unnerving about it, something that made me feel like I wasn't alone out here. I stoked the fire, trying to shake off the chill crawling up my spine. That's when I noticed the silence. The usual forest sounds, the rustling, the chirping of insects, had all stopped. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the woods were holding their breath. I sat still, listening, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But then, just beyond the reach of the firelight, I saw movement. At first it was a shadow, just a flicker, something I could have easily written off as a trick of the light. But then it moved again, too fast, darting between the trees. I squinted into the darkness, but whatever it was had already disappeared into the shadows. That was enough for me. I doused the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a deer or some other harmless animal. But that didn't stop the uneasy feeling gnawing at my gut. I lay there listening. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying that howl, the way it echoed unnaturally through the trees. And then, the sound of footsteps. Not the quiet, shuffling steps of an animal, but slow, deliberate footsteps like someone walking around the perimeter of my camp. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The steps circled the tent, closer and closer. They were too heavy to be any kind of animal I'd encountered in these woods. I reached for the knife in my pack, gripping it tightly as I waited. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear breathing. Slow, deep breaths, almost as if whatever was out there was smelling the air, searching for something. The tent walls rustled slightly, as though someone, or something, was brushing against them. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I couldn't. Then, without warning, the zipper on my tent began to move, slowly, carefully, like someone was testing it, seeing if I was still inside. My blood ran cold. I gripped the knife tighter, waiting for whatever was out there to come inside. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the zipper stopped. The footsteps moved away, retreating into the darkness. I lay there, shaking, listening to the sound fade into the distance. It was gone. But something told me it wasn't far. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my knife, my eyes wide open, staring at the tent flap. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time. I packed up my gear as fast as I could and started the hike back to my car. The forest felt different in the daylight, less menacing, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I saw him. A park ranger standing by the entrance, his back to me. I hadn't seen any other cars on the way in, so I was surprised to see someone out here this early. I called out to him, relieved to see another person after that terrifying night. "Hey, good morning," I said, trying to sound casual. The ranger didn't respond. He just stood there, his back still facing me, his body unnaturally still. Something about him seemed off. I stepped closer, about to speak again, when he slowly turned around. My blood froze. His face was pale, almost sickly, his eyes wide and empty. But it wasn't his face that terrified me. It was the fact that his mouth was open, hanging in a twisted, unnatural grin, and from it came that same low, haunting howl I had heard the night before. I stumbled back, heart racing, and without thinking, I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, practically throwing myself inside and speeding off. I didn't look back once. It's been 3 days since I left Black Hollow Woods, and I still can't shake the feeling that I didn't come back alone. Every night, just as I'm about to fall asleep, I hear it, that same howl, soft at first, but growing louder. And then, the footsteps, circling my house. Whatever was in those woods followed me, and now it's waiting. The trip was supposed to be an escape, a chance to get away from everything and everyone. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. I'd been planning this camping trip for months, a solo venture deep into the black pine forest, a place so remote it didn't even have a proper trail on most maps. Exactly what I was looking for. A couple of locals had warned me against going alone, but I brushed them off. I wasn't afraid of isolation. In fact, I craved it. I wanted to be alone. The first day went by in a breeze. I set up my tent in a small clearing, close to a creek. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, the sounds of birds and rushing water filling the emptiness. It was perfect. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I started a fire and settled in. That's when I heard the first sound. It was subtle at first, just a faint rustling in the trees, barely audible over the crackling fire. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or maybe a deer. But then it happened again, closer this time. A soft, scraping noise like claws against bark. I glanced into the darkness, straining my eyes, but saw nothing. I shook it off and convinced myself it was just the forest's usual nocturnal activity. But I couldn't shake the unease that had crept into my bones. It was as if the trees themselves were watching, their twisted branches stretching out like gnarled fingers. I forced myself to sleep, though it was restless. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again, that strange scraping sound coming from a different direction each time. I half expected to wake up and find claw marks all over my tent. Morning came, and I was relieved to see the sunlight streaming through the trees, chasing away the shadows and whatever else might have been lurking in them. I convinced myself that I was just jumpy, letting my imagination get the better of me. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. I spent the day hiking deeper into the forest, hoping to shake the sense of unease. I tried to enjoy the scenery, but the strange occurrences from the night before lingered in the back of my mind. Every so often I thought I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement between the trees, a dark figure just beyond my line of sight. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. By dusk, I was back at my campsite, and I was exhausted. As night fell, the forest grew eerily silent. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound. I fed the fire, hoping its light would keep whatever was out there at bay. Then I heard it again, the same scraping sound, closer this time. My skin prickled as I scanned the darkness, but the firelight only stretched so far. I stood up, holding my flashlight in one hand and a knife in the other. I wasn't going to let my mind play tricks on me again. I heard a low growl, so deep it was almost a vibration in my chest. My heart pounded as I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a pair of yellow eyes staring back at me from the shadows. They were too high up to belong to any ordinary animal. As the creature stepped into the light, my breath caught in my throat. It was a massive wolf-like figure, but not quite right. It stood on two legs, its fur matted and dirty, limbs too long and fingers tipped with sharp, curved claws. Its face was twisted, almost human-like, but its mouth stretched too wide, filled with jagged teeth. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it spoke. Not with words exactly, but with a voice that seemed to echo inside my mind. A guttural, mocking whisper that sounded almost like my own voice. "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. Skinwalker. I'd heard stories, but I never believed them. Yet here I was, staring into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away from that thing. Branches scratched at my arms and face as I tore through the underbrush. I could hear it behind me, a heavy, deliberate padding sound like it was toying with me. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. The forest seemed to twist around me, the trees closing in, the path unfamiliar and disorienting. I stumbled into a small clearing, and that's when I saw them, more yellow eyes peering out from the darkness. I was surrounded. The creatures stepped forward one by one, each more grotesque than the last. Some looked almost like people, with twisted limbs and faces stretched into unnatural shapes. Others were more animalistic, resembling wolves, bears, things I couldn't even put a name to. And then I noticed something horrifying. Their faces, they weren't just random. They looked like people I knew, twisted and distorted, but unmistakable. There was my friend John, who had gone missing a year ago, and my old boss, who'd disappeared during a hunting trip. Each of them stared at me with those same yellow eyes, their mouths stretching into unnatural smiles. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear as they closed in on me. The leader, my own face staring back at me, leaned in close, its breath hot and rancid. "We've been waiting for you," it whispered. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was alone. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and the forest looked almost normal. Almost. My tent was gone, my supplies scattered. I staggered to my feet, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it a nightmare? As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something on the ground. Claw marks, deep and fresh, scored into the earth in a perfect circle around where I'd been lying. And I knew with a sickening certainty that I was no longer alone. The creatures had let me go, but they'd marked me, claimed me. I wasn't the hunter in these woods, I was the hunted, and I knew sooner or later they'd be back. I've been a park ranger in the remote woods of the Pacific Northwest for nearly 10 years. This place has always felt like home. Endless miles of towering trees, dense fog that rolls in at dawn, and the quiet isolation that comes with being stationed miles from the nearest town. But last week something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about these woods. It started like any other night. The fire in my cabin was crackling, casting a warm glow against the wooden walls, and the wind howled outside, typical for this time of year. My job was simple that night: monitor the radio, check the trails the next morning, and ensure no campers were lost or in danger. Routine. Boring even. Just as I was about to turn in, the radio crackled to life. "Help. Please. Anyone. Something's out here." The voice was barely audible, distorted by static. It sounded like a man, but there was something off, an edge of panic that chilled me. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, thinking maybe a camper had wandered too far or gotten spooked by a bear. The voice didn't give me a location, but I knew the area like the back of my hand. I followed the main trail deeper into the woods, the cold biting at my skin as the canopy above blotted out the stars. After about an hour of walking, I noticed something strange. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, even the distant rustling of small animals, had vanished. The silence was unnatural, heavy. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't shake the voice from the radio. I pushed on. That's when I saw the footprints. At first glance they looked human, but they were wrong. Too long, too narrow. And they were fresh, leading off the trail into the dense brush. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The further I went, the more disoriented I felt. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the air grew thick with the stench of rot. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something. Just at the edge of the light, a figure darting between the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the dark. Then the noises began. At first it was a soft rustling, like something moving through the leaves behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I kept walking, quickening my pace, but the rustling followed. No matter how fast I moved, it stayed just out of sight. My flashlight flickered again, and in the brief strobe of light, I caught a glimpse of it. A hunched figure, its limbs unnaturally long, crouching low to the ground. Panic surged through me. I started running, crashing through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest felt like a maze, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The trees, once familiar, now loomed like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. As I ran, the sounds grew louder. Not just the rustling now, but whispers, faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to echo in my head. My legs burned and my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled into a clearing. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the open space. And that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure, tall, gaunt, with skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin. It was human, but not quite. The smell of decay wafted toward me, and I gagged, backing away. The thing took a step forward and then another, moving with an unnatural, jerky motion, like it wasn't used to its own body. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing, but nothing made sense. I raised my flashlight and the creature flinched, hissing, before retreating into the tree line. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted back toward the cabin, not caring if I was heading in the right direction. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent, but I kept running. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I slammed the door shut and bolted it. My chest heaved, and sweat drenched my clothes, but I was safe, or so I thought. The radio crackled to life again, and this time the voice was clear. It was my own. "I'm out here, lost. Please help me." I stared at the radio, my blood turning to ice. That wasn't possible. I was here, inside, listening. But then I realized the truth. The horrible, gut-wrenching truth that made my skin crawl. The voice wasn't asking for help. It was mimicking me, trying to lure me back outside. My hand trembled as I turned off the radio, but before I could fully process what had just happened, a knock came at the door. Slow, deliberate, too loud to be human. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. Then I heard it, a voice from the other side, distorted, familiar. "Let me in, I'm lost. It's cold out here." It was my voice. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it. And then the knocking stopped, replaced by something far worse, a scraping sound like nails dragging across the wood. The windows rattled, and for the briefest moment I saw it again. Pressed against the glass, its hollow eyes staring in, the creature grinned, that impossible grin. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out, because when I woke up, the sun was rising, and the forest was quiet again. Normal. But as I stepped outside, my blood ran cold. On the ground, leading away from my cabin, were footprints, long, narrow footprints, the same ones I'd seen in the woods. And worse, right outside my door, written in the dirt, was a single word: soon. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I turned in my resignation the next day. But sometimes late at night I hear it, the faint rustling, the whispers, and I wonder, did I ever really leave those woods, or did something follow me home? I'd heard the rumors about ember pines for years, strange lights, unnatural sounds, people who vanished without a trace. They said the woods were haunted, cursed, or worse. But that only made me more curious. My brother Sam and I had been into cryptids and ghost stories since we were kids, so when he suggested we camp there, I jumped at the chance. I didn't realize that the stories weren't just legends, and that what waited for us in those woods was beyond anything we could have imagined. We set up camp at the edge of the forest, right near an old trail that hadn't been used in decades. The place was eerily quiet, no sounds of birds or insects, just an overwhelming silence that pressed in around us. We tried to laugh it off, telling ourselves it was just because the forest was so remote. As we settled in, I noticed a strange carving on a tree nearby. It looked like an eye, with 3 lines extending from it, almost like it was crying. Sam, always the skeptic, shrugged it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The first night was uneventful, but the second night was when things started getting weird. Around midnight, a low hum echoed through the woods, vibrating through the ground like a heartbeat. I sat up, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sam woke up too, wide-eyed, and we exchanged a look, neither of us saying a word. Then we saw it. a faint light flickering through the trees, moving erratically, almost like it was searching for something. We grabbed our flashlights and decided to follow it, curiosity getting the better of us. The light led us deeper into the woods, weaving through the trees with a strange, hypnotic rhythm. I felt like I was in a trance, my feet moving almost against my will. After a while, we came to a small clearing, and there in the center stood a cabin. It was old, half-collapsed, with the roof caved in and the windows shattered. But what caught my attention was the smell, like rotting meat and sulfur, so thick it made my eyes water. We should have turned back, but Sam was already pushing the door open, his flashlight sweeping across the dusty interior. The walls were covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood, and on the floor were bones scattered in haphazard piles. They looked like animal bones, but some of them seemed larger, almost human. Then we heard it, footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, crunching over the fallen leaves. I grabbed Sam's arm, and we both froze, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps circled the cabin, pausing now and then as if whoever or whatever it was could sense our fear. Suddenly the door creaked open wider, and in stepped a figure. He was wearing a park ranger's uniform, but it was tattered, filthy, and hanging off him like it didn't quite fit. His skin was pallid, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were a deep, unsettling yellow, glowing faintly in the darkness. "Evening," he drawled, his voice thick and raspy like he hadn't used it in years. "You boys lost?" I wanted to speak, but my throat was dry and my body felt paralyzed. Sam managed to stammer out, "We're just camping. We didn't mean to trespass." The ranger tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he looked us over. "Trespassing, huh? This here's a special place. People come here to forget, or to be forgotten." He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on me now, and I felt a chill settle over me, colder than any winter night. "Once you step into these woods," he continued, "they claim you. I reckon it's too late for you now." Without another word, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows like he'd never been there at all. Sam and I bolted, running back toward the campsite as fast as we could, our flashlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. But when we reached the spot where we'd set up camp, it was gone. The tent, the fire pit, our gear, everything was missing, as if we'd never been there. I looked around, trying to find any sign that we were in the right place, but all I saw were trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. The woods were different now, twisted and foreign. Trees seemed to loom over us, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I could feel eyes on us, watching from the shadows, and strange sounds filled the air. Whispers, laughter, things moving just beyond the reach of our lights. We wandered for hours, or maybe it was minutes, it was impossible to tell. The woods seemed to twist around us, every path leading us back to the same spot, the clearing with that damned cabin, and each time we returned it looked a little different, older, more decayed, like it was feeding off our fear. Finally we heard voices, familiar ones. They were calling our names, echoing through the trees, coming from every direction at once. They sounded like our friends, our family, but distorted, stretched out like they were speaking underwater. Sam began to shout back, but I grabbed his arm, pulling him away. "Those aren't real," I hissed, but I wasn't even sure I believed it. "They're trying to lure us in." We stumbled onward, driven by sheer desperation, until we finally burst out onto a trail. I don't know how we found it, but we ran, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods and collapsed near the road. Only then did we look back, and in the distance, just beyond the tree line, we saw the ranger again, his yellow eyes watching us, a grim smile on his face. He lifted a hand in a slow wave before vanishing back into the trees. We never found our gear, and no one believed our story. But as we left Ember Pines, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of us had stayed behind, claimed by the forest. Even now, I sometimes hear those voices in my dreams calling me back to the woods, and I know that if I ever return, I won't make it out again. I don't know why I ever thought camping in the dense woods of Black Hollow was a good idea, but there I was, deep in the thick of it, with only my old tent and a dwindling campfire to keep me company. It was just supposed to be a peaceful weekend escape from the city, a chance to clear my mind and breathe in the wilderness. But now, every tree, every shadow seemed to watch me, like the forest had eyes that could see straight through me. The first night it was just the usual forest noises, branches creaking, leaves rustling, and the occasional animal scampering through the underbrush. But as the hours crept toward midnight, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was a low guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a moan. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like the forest itself was alive, whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel something watching me. I thought I was just paranoid until, around dawn, I spotted a figure standing at the edge of my camp. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but when I opened my eyes again, he was still there. A park ranger, or at least he looked like one, in a tattered uniform and hat pulled low over his face. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice thick and gravelly. "This isn't a place for people like you." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just camping. I'll be gone by tomorrow." The ranger just stared at me, his face hidden in the shadows of his hat. He didn't say another word. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I should have packed up right then and there. But I didn't. I convinced myself he was just a local weirdo trying to scare me off. The next day I tried to hike up to the lake, hoping the fresh air and sunlight would ease my mind. But the deeper I went into the forest, the darker it seemed to get. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching for me. The silence was oppressive, and then there was that sound again, that same guttural moan echoing from somewhere beyond the trees. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the wind doesn't whisper your name. By late afternoon, I started to feel like I was being followed. I kept catching glimpses of something moving between the trees just out of sight. I would turn, and there would be nothing, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I picked up my pace, almost running back to camp, feeling that if I looked back, I'd see something I could never unsee. When I finally made it back to my camp, everything was wrong. My tent was torn open, my belongings strewn across the ground. But the strangest thing was the footprints, deep, heavy prints that circled my campfire in a strange, looping pattern. They looked almost human, but too large, and with long, claw-like toes that dug deep into the earth. Night fell again, and the forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees leaning in as if they were listening. I built up the fire as high as it would go, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there at bay. But the flames cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then, just as the fire began to die down, I saw him again, the park ranger, standing just beyond the edge of the light. "Didn't I tell you to leave?" His voice was a hiss, barely louder than a whisper, but it cut through the night like a knife. I couldn't see his face, but his eyes glinted, catching the firelight with a strange animalistic glow. "What do you want?" I shouted, gripping the knife I'd kept at my side since the night before. He took a step closer, his movements jerky, unnatural. "This place, it has rules. You broke them." His voice was changing, growing deeper, distorted. I watched in horror as his body began to shift, his limbs elongating, twisting into shapes that defied nature. A skinwalker. I stumbled back, trying to keep the fire between us, but it was no use. He, or it, was faster, circling me, its form shifting, warping in the shadows. One moment it looked human, the next it was a grotesque mix of man and beast, with long, sinewy arms and a face that seemed to stretch and melt like wax. I turned and ran, my only thought to get away, but the forest seemed to conspire against me. Branches snagged at my clothes, roots rose up to trip me, and all the while I could hear it behind me, its heavy, uneven footsteps gaining ground. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found myself back at my campfire, the flames now nothing more than dying embers. I looked around. breathing hard, and there he was again, standing on the opposite side of the fire pit, watching me with those inhuman eyes. "You'll never leave," he whispered, his voice echoing in my head, more than just sound. It was like the forest itself was speaking to me. "You're one of us now." I didn't understand, but I could feel it, the change creeping into my bones, crawling under my skin. My limbs felt heavy, like they weren't mine anymore. I looked down at my hands, and they seemed to ripple, shifting, the skin twisting into shapes that weren't human. And then I knew I wasn't alone in my body anymore. Something else was there, something ancient, something that belonged to the forest. I looked up, and the Skinwalker was gone, but I could feel him, inside me, a part of me now. The last thing I remember is the sound of my own voice, but it wasn't me anymore. It was deeper, harsher, echoing through the trees like a warning. I stumbled back into the forest, my mind slipping away, merging with something else, something that would never let me leave. And now, if you ever find yourself in Black Hollow, you might hear a voice in the dark calling your name, a warning or perhaps an invitation, because I'm still here wandering the woods waiting. I may look like a park ranger or maybe someone you know, but it's not me anymore. It's the forest calling you home. I wasn't supposed to be out there that night. It was late, and everyone else at the campsite had already turned in, but I couldn't sleep. I'd always loved the night, the quiet, the solitude, the way the world feels different when it's bathed in moonlight. So, I decided to go for a walk, just a quick one, to clear my head. I left the campfire behind, its embers still glowing faintly in the distance as I stepped into the woods. The trees were tall, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the stars. The moonlight barely filtered through, but I had my flashlight with me. I wasn't worried. I knew these woods, or at least I thought I did. The trail I followed was narrow, a faint path that looked more like an animal trail than something carved out by humans. I wasn't far from camp, maybe a quarter mile, but already the sounds of the others, the crackling fire, the occasional murmur from a tent had faded. All I could hear now was the soft crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It was peaceful. That's why I didn't turn back right away. The air was cool, and the quiet was calming. I kept walking, enjoying the isolation, but after a few minutes, I noticed something odd. The wind had stopped, and with it, every other sound. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just silence. A silence so deep, it pressed in on me, filling my ears like a weight. I stopped, turning off my flashlight for a moment to let my eyes adjust to the darkness. My breath came out in soft clouds in the cold night air. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, I saw it. Ahead of me, just past the edge of my flashlight's beam, something shifted. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, the way the trees play tricks on your mind in the dark. But then it moved again, slow and deliberate, and I realized it was something tall standing between the trees. I clicked the flashlight back on, sweeping the beam across the woods. The figure was gone. My heart was pounding now, though I wasn't sure why. It was probably just a deer, I told myself, or maybe my eyes playing tricks on me. I took a few more steps down the path, telling myself I was fine, that the woods were safe. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. The air felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating. I turned around, deciding to head back to camp, but when I did, I froze. The path behind me wasn't there anymore. I blinked, shining my light over where the trail should have been. Nothing, just trees. Thick, twisted trees that seemed to have moved, shifted while my back was turned. My breathing quickened. I was sure the trail had been there a second ago. I hadn't gone off it, hadn't wandered far enough to lose it. But now, it was gone. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I'd been hiking these woods for years. I knew how easy it was to get turned around in the dark. All I had to do was retrace my steps, keep moving toward where I thought the camp was, and I'd be fine. But as I walked, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches stretching out like gnarled fingers. That's when I heard the sound. At first it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like something tapping against wood. I stopped, listening, and the sound grew louder, closer, tap, tap, tap. It was coming from behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to run. My instincts were screaming at me. Something wasn't right, something was wrong with these woods. But my legs felt like lead, frozen in place. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder now, impossibly close, like someone or something was standing right behind me. I finally forced myself to move, slowly turning my head, the flashlight shaking in my hands as I pointed it toward the sound. And then I saw it, a figure standing just a few feet away. Tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, stretching out unnaturally from its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the flashlight's beam, and its face, God, its face, it didn't have one. Just a smooth, featureless expanse where eyes, a mouth, should have been. But it wasn't the faceless thing that terrified me the most. It was the sound. That tapping, it was coming from its fingers, long, bony fingers that ended in sharp, pointed nails. It was tapping one of them against a tree rhythmically, like it was counting down to something. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, tapping, watching me, even though it had no eyes. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I sprinted blindly through the woods. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop until I burst out of the trees and stumbled into the clearing where our campsite was. I collapsed by the fire, gasping for breath, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. The others were still asleep, the campfire burning low. I looked back toward the trees, expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight, jumping at every sound, every rustle of leaves. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things without a word and left, not bothering to explain to the others why I was leaving early. I haven't been back to those woods since. I don't think I ever will, because I know deep down that it's still out there, and it's waiting for me. I've always believed that the woods hold a certain kind of magic, a quiet, peaceful magic that draws you in and allows you to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. That's why, despite my friends bailing last minute, I decided to head out for a solo camping trip. It was supposed to be relaxing, a weekend of solitude, just me and nature. I couldn't have been more wrong. I chose a spot deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, far from any popular trails. The kind of place where you wouldn't run into another soul for miles. That's what I liked about it, the isolation. I packed my gear, hiked in, and set up camp by a small creek that trickled through the dense forest. The sun was setting as I got the fire going, the woods already darkening around me. It wasn't long before I noticed the silence, not the peaceful kind, but the suffocating, heavy kind. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the crackling of my fire and my own breathing. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that maybe it was just the time of year, or maybe the wildlife was keeping its distance. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As the night wore on, I began to feel that creeping sense of being watched. It started as a tingle on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you're walking down an empty street, but somehow feel someone's eyes on you. I kept glancing around the fire, into the shadows between the trees, but saw nothing. The feeling persisted, though, gnawing at me, making me feel more and more uneasy. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, it's easy to let your mind run wild when you're alone in the middle of nowhere. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and forced myself to sleep. That's when the footsteps started. At first they were faint, soft crunches on the forest floor, like someone or something was circling my camp. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they stopped just as suddenly as they started. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, my heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing there, just the flickering remnants of my dying fire and the darkness of the forest beyond. But I could feel it. Something was out there, watching. I zipped the tent back up and lay there, wide awake, every nerve on edge. The footsteps came again, this time louder, closer. My mouth went dry, and I gripped the knife I kept by my side. I was trying to convince myself it was an animal, but the pattern of the steps, too steady, too human, sent a chill down my spine. They stopped right outside my tent. For what felt like hours, there was nothing but silence. I didn't dare move. I could hear my own heartbeat, the blood rushing in my ears, but outside, nothing. No movement, no sound. Then a soft scraping against the fabric of the tent, slow, deliberate, as if someone was dragging their hand across it. I bit back a scream, squeezing my knife tighter, waiting for something to happen. The scraping continued for a few moments, then stopped. Silence again. I didn't sleep that night. When the first light of dawn broke, I scrambled out of the tent, ready to pack up and leave as fast as possible. But when I stepped outside, my blood ran cold. The ground around my tent was disturbed. Footprints. Bare human footprints. They circled my tent over and over again, like someone had been walking around me all night, watching. I was done. I packed up my gear in record time, not caring about how neatly anything went into my bag. I just wanted to get out of there. Fast. But as I turned to head back toward the trail, something caught my eye. There was something hanging from a tree just at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't there the day before, I was sure of it. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to get a closer look. It was a bundle. A small, twisted bundle made of twigs and string hanging from a thin piece of twine. It swayed gently in the morning breeze. As I got closer, I realized there was something else tied to it, something dark, almost black, dried and shriveled. My stomach churned when I recognized it. It was a finger, a human finger. Panic surged through me and I turned and bolted. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, crashing through the woods, not caring about the noise I made or how far I still had to go. My only thought was to get out, to get away from whatever was out there. After what felt like hours of running, I finally made it back to the trailhead. My car was still parked there, the sight of it a relief that almost brought me to my knees. I threw my gear into the back seat and peeled out of there, not once looking back. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a long time. Who would believe me? A bundle of twigs, a human finger, footsteps circling my tent in the middle of the night. It sounds like something out of a bad horror movie. But it was real. Too real. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through the local news when something caught my eye. A hiker had gone missing in the same area I'd camped. The article said he'd been an experienced outdoorsman, well prepared. But his friends found his campsite abandoned, his tent slashed open from the inside. The search parties found no sign of him, other than one thing. A small bundle of twigs hanging from a tree near his camp. I haven't been camping since, and I don't plan to, ever again. I've always thought of camping as a way to escape, a way to recharge and forget about life for a while. But what I didn't expect was that my last trip would make me question reality itself. A few months ago, I decided to head out to a remote section of the Catskills. It was a spot that a friend had told me about, far off the beaten path, where you could camp by a pristine lake surrounded by dense forest. It sounded perfect. I needed the time alone, away from work, away from people. I packed my gear, drove out to the trailhead, and started the 5-mile hike to the lake. When I arrived, the place was everything I had imagined. Beautiful, untouched, peaceful. The lake's surface was so still it reflected the sky perfectly, like a mirror. I was the only one there. No other hikers, no signs of anyone having been there in months. That's exactly how I wanted it. I set up my tent just a few feet from the shore and spent the evening relaxing by the water, as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lake. I built a fire, cooked a small meal, and settled in for the night. That's when things started to feel off. The first thing I noticed was the reflection in the lake. I was sitting by the fire, and out of the corner of my eye, I caught my own reflection on the water's surface. Only, something was wrong. My reflection was sitting there just like me, but it didn't match my movements exactly. When I leaned forward to poke at the fire, it hesitated, like it was mimicking me, but with a slight delay. I stared at it for a moment, trying to figure out if it was a trick of the light or my imagination, but the longer I watched, the more obvious it became. My reflection was moving, but it wasn't in sync with me. And then it smiled. I wasn't smiling, my blood ran cold. I stood up, and so did my reflection. Again, a split second too late. The smile didn't leave its face, stretching wider than it should have. I backed away from the water, my heart racing. The reflection followed, still smiling, its eyes fixed on mine. I looked behind me, expecting to see something, on the shore of the lake. But there was nothing there, just me and the darkening woods. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a weird trick of the light, maybe the ripples on the water distorting the image. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I turned away from the lake, determined to focus on the fire, to push the strange occurrence out of my mind. But then I heard a splash. It was soft, barely audible, but enough to make me turn around. There, in the middle of the lake, was something moving. The water rippled outward, slow and deliberate, as if something was gliding just beneath the surface. I squinted, trying to see what it was, but the fading light made it hard to make out any details. Whatever it was coming closer. The water lapped at the shore as the thing, whatever it was, moved toward me. And then it stopped, just a few feet from the edge of the lake, its shape hidden beneath the still surface. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the water. For a moment I saw nothing but my reflection again, still smiling, still wrong. But then, just beneath my reflection, something else appeared. A face. Pale, almost translucent, with hollow, sunken eyes. It stared up at me from the depths of the lake, its mouth opening slowly into a wide, unnatural grin, just like my reflection had. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The face in the water didn't move. It just kept staring, unblinking, the grin widening until it looked like the skin around its mouth might tear. I ran. I don't remember grabbing my gear. I don't remember packing anything. All I know is that I sprinted back through the woods, the light from my flashlight bouncing off the trees as I tore down the trail. I could hear splashes behind me, soft at first, but growing louder, faster. Something was following me. The whole time I kept glancing back, expecting to see the face, the thing from the lake. But I didn't. What I saw instead was something worse. It was me. Running through the trees behind me was me. Or at least it looked like me. But it wasn't right. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Its face was twisted into that same horrible grin I had seen in the water. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The thing that looked like me was getting closer, its footsteps growing louder, faster, but still wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. When I finally reached my car, I didn't stop. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and floored it. As I sped down the narrow dirt road, I caught one last glimpse of it standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. It was still smiling. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was well out of the forest. By the time I reached the nearest town, the sun was rising, and I was shaking so badly I could barely keep my hands on the wheel. I didn't tell anyone what happened. How could I? Who would believe that my reflection came to life, that something was chasing me through the woods, wearing my face, But now every time I look in the mirror, I can't shake the feeling that something is off. Just a little. My reflection is always a beat too slow, and sometimes when I turn away, I swear I see it, smiling,